right there. Hi,
Hi,
Jeff. How are you?
fine,
So I think
thanks. Glad to
I
be
think
here.
I think we're all set to get started. Unless I don't know if David, if you're still there, if you have anything more you want to say, technically wise. Are you all set up, Jeff?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to County Reads. So great to be here. I should just say to everybody, my name is Tom Harris. I'm moderating this session today. I'm a farmer, teacher, lawyer. I live in Cherry Valley, Ontario, and I'm so pleased to be here with County Reads to talk to Jeff about his book, which I'll give you a picture of it here. I got a copy. So you can't see it's backwards, but you get the idea. That's the cover. And that's available in the library and at the bookstore, which is where I got my copy. Jeff Rubin, who many of you may already know or be aware of. I remember seeing you guest speaking on several news shows at several points. But just to be formal about your introduction, you're a Canadian economist and a best-selling author. You're a world-leading expert on trade and energy, the former chief economist and chief strategist at CIBC World Markets. You've recently served as a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance, founded by Jim Balsillie. Your first book, Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, was an international bestseller. The book was a #1 best-selling nonfiction book in Canada and won the National Book Business Award, as well as being longlisted for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award. He is also the author of bestsellers, The End of Growth and the Carbon Bubble. And as I say, we're here today to talk about The Expendables. The subtitle is How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization, was a national bestseller. So I gather you're probably remotely somewhere at home there, Jeff. Is that right?
Yep, I'm remotely at home where most people are.
I don't know. When I was looking at this book, I have a background in history, so I was really interested in the how well written it was, in the sense that you've tied not just economic questions into it, but also a real historical perspective that goes across decades, if not centuries. And I thought to myself, another good subtitle might be "What's Old is New Again." And you start in 1957, and you talk about how that is very similar to the current year in many ways, but in probably one of the most important ways, given your thesis, is not. And I wonder if you could just tell us why that might be the case, why 1957 is a comparable year in some ways to start.
Well, 1957, for those who may recall, was when the Asian flu first washed ashore. And it had, for a short period of time, much of the same impacts as the current COVID pandemic has had. And I describe, various facets of it. And of course, you think that I'm talking about COVID-19, but I'm actually talking about the Asian flu. Why that's particularly significant, more significant than when I first was writing the book, was, of course, what COVID-19 has done. And I think that has really issued a mortal blow to globalization. Because up until COVID-19, not only did virtually all economists think that globalization was both beneficial and, maybe more importantly, inevitable, but so too did governments, and particularly our government, because Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland have probably been some of the strongest advocates of globalization within the G7. And how the goalposts have moved. Okay, I mean, there's been a quantum change. And first it was with respirators and masks, if you recall. And later it came to be about vaccines. So all of a sudden, something that we took for granted, the just-in-time global supply chains that our whole economy is predicated upon, all of a sudden, just in time became just too late. And we weren't talking about lawn chairs, okay? We were talking about things that people's lives depended on, whether you're talking about ventilators or vaccines.
Or toilet paper.
Yeah, and I think that that's been a game changer. Maybe not for how our current government in Ottawa thinks, but I think for consumers and businesses, not just in Canada, but around the OECD, that is a game changer, that all of a sudden there's this powerful incentive to be economically self-sufficient in things that critically matter. And that's going to lead to a reversal of what we've seen in the last 40 years. That's going to lead to the repatriation of jobs that we thought were gone forever. And the interesting thing about trade is the new barriers to trade, they're not the Donald Trump tariffs. They're the export restrictions, okay? In other words, they're restrictions from countries that we're relying on to import critically needed goods. They're saying,
Right.
sorry, we have to restrict these exports because we have to serve our own populations first, which is, a totally reasonable thing for them to do. But I think it really challenges everything that we've been led to believe about global supply chains and indeed globalization.
Well, that's a great spot to end on, because I kind of just want to step back a bit from your opening statement there, because you've covered a lot of ground. And I think it's probably fair to say, as you've said in your remarks, that most economists for the last 40 years have said globalization is a good thing. And in fact, I can remember most of the politicians I've had the opportunity to work with saying exactly the same thing. It's been a very rare person that's suggested otherwise, except maybe, some protesters in Seattle 20 years ago, right?
Right.
And so it's a little controversial in some ways that you, as a world-class economist, is actually saying that. I'm curious, A, what do you mean? And B, how did you come to that view?
Well, okay. Globalization has been a huge success for some people, and particularly for corporations, okay? It means that Apple's not paying the California minimum wage to assemble iPhones. They're buying it from some supplier in China or Vietnam who's paying $1, $1.50. And if you're an Apple shareholder, that's a great thing, okay? Yeah. But what a lot of people, not just me, but a lot of people are asking is, how come real wages in countries like Canada and the United States haven't grown since the mid-1970s? I mean, 50 years is a hell of a long time to go without a wage increase. And it's related specifically to these global supply chains, because what these global supply chains have done is uprooted middle-class jobs, manufacturing jobs that used to produce the very things that we consumed, whether it was cars, televisions, or for that matter, pharmaceuticals back in the 70s, and has shifted them to the lowest common denominator. Now, the lowest common denominator for wages is the highest common denominator for shareholders, because the two things are not unrelated. And, I was a chief economist of an investment bank for 20 years. I understand that. What's lacking? What's been lacking is some balance between what's good for shareholders and what's good for the middle class. And ironically, I think that there is going to be a silver lining from this pandemic for the middle class. Because the one common feature of pandemics, going back to the bubonic plague, to the Spanish flu, is they have all raised wages in their wake. Now, the mechanism under which that occurred was the physical decimation of the peasantry, and hence the price of labor rose. Hopefully, we're not going to rely on the same transmission mechanism this time around. But I think we're going to get to the same result, because when you throw out global supply chains, when people lose confidence in global supply chains and start becoming economically self-sufficient and start producing the very things they consume, that's a good news story for North American workers. Because if you no longer have the threat of closing down your factory and moving it to China or India, guess what? You just might go on strike, and you just might get the wage increase that you haven't got for the last 50 years. And while that may not be a great news story for shareholders, it's sure a good news story for a rapidly shrinking middle class. So Who knows? I mean, the world is changing. The pandemic has been a game changer. It's showing us that something we've all taken for granted just isn't what we've been told.
Right. So, I mean, I said controversial. I say controversial only in the sense that it kind of runs against the mainstream. I think it's fair to say that there have been warnings, people shouting those warnings for many decades in some cases. John Turner in his 1988 free trade debate strikes me as being one example, but also Ross Perot in the United States.
Right.
That sucking sound that you hear as your job's flushing down the drain.
Right.
Were John Turner and Ross Perot right when they were warning us about free trade?
Absolutely. They were 100% right. And isn't it ironic that the same party that John Turner led and fought against the free trade agreement, that party is now led by people who are among the G7, the greatest apostles of globalization. I'm talking about Justin Trudeau and his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. So right. How the goalposts have moved, but I'm suggesting they are about to move yet again. And COVID-19 is the catalyst for that movement.
So when US-Canada free trade seemed like it was not a bad deal at first, though.
Actually, it wasn't the real deal. Because US-Canada, you're talking about countries that basically have the same wage rate. Right. Okay, there's a little bit of movement on the exchange rate, but for all intent and purposes, cost competitive. That's why when we had the Auto Pact that guaranteed a certain level of production in Canada, there was never a mass movement of American jobs to Canada above and beyond that, because there really wasn't an economic incentive to do that. Now, right. When you put Mexico into the equation, you're now conducting a free trade zone, not between two countries that have comparable wages and income per capita, but a country that has a minimum wage of $5 a day and income per capita, a tenth of Canada and Mexico. Right. All of a sudden, there's a massive incentive for everybody from Magna to General Motors not to move just out of Canada, to move out of the United States and go to Mexico, which is all possible because then you can export the cars and parts back to Canada and the US tariff-free. This is the brilliant trade agreement that Chrystia Freeland is so proud of, okay? It's hollowed out the auto industry, but it's a microcosm of what's happened to middle-class jobs, not just in Canada, but across the OECD for the last 30, 40 years, under the rubric of originally GATT and later its successor, the World Trade Organization.
So, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've all, seen what's happened with politics in the United States. And, we've heard a lot of these, at least some of these economic arguments being made by Donald Trump and also by Bernie Sanders, seemingly diametrically opposed politically. Yet you make the point in the book that they're really not that far apart, and maybe in some respects they weren't wrong.
On trade policy, and I'm sure neither of them would like to acknowledge this, nor would their supporters, but on trade policy, they basically had identical policies, okay? They said that the trading regime under the World Trade Organization was hugely skewed against American workers, and by the way, Canadian workers as well, in favor of countries like China, okay? That China could export a car or a good into the United States or Canada at a fraction of the tariffs that we would face trying to sell goods into China. And the point that I made, and this goes back, I think you mentioned quite kindly that there's a historical element to this book that really starts with the repeal of the British Corn Laws in 1830, because this isn't globalization's first rodeo. Okay? Yes, right. Some would argue that the real golden age of globalization was 1850 to 1914, but without getting into the academic esoterica of it, this isn't the first time this has happened. But what we're seeing here and back then is populism can hit from both sides of the plate. and it had in the past, and it did in the US, because here you had Bernie Sanders, who was as much an outsider to the Democratic Party as Donald Trump was to the Republican Party. They were both basically saying the same thing on trade. The only difference is that the Democratic Party was able to shut Sanders out, where the Republican Party, much to the horror of people like Mitch McConnell, was not able to shut Trump out. But I'm just saying, but if you go back to the 1920s, the revolts that we saw from both, the Russian Revolution, but we also saw the rise of fascism too. Both were the response of people being left behind, okay? And just as then as now, people have been left behind. Like GDP has done great. Okay, like it's not the economy doesn't grow, it's there's no longer a connection between economic growth and the welfare of the majority of the people in the economy. And that happened after the first round of globalization, and it didn't end well. Okay, there was social discord. The rise of totalitarianism was because people lost confidence in liberal democracy. And the reason for that was that liberal democracy was not putting any food on the table.
Is that happening now?
Yes.
Loss of confidence?
It is, I think. Yeah. It is. And right now, it's been the populist right. And obviously, Donald Trump's victory emboldened the populist right all throughout Europe. And it didn't just start with Donald Trump. It really started with Brexit, because that was the first wake-up call that, by the way, we weren't buying this stuff anymore about how great globalization is, okay? Right. And even when Mark Carney, who was then the governor of the Bank of England, said this would be economically disastrous for Britons to leave the EU, guess what? They voted to leave the EU, okay?
They kept pursuing
confidence. But I'm just saying it could just as easily have been from the left. And indeed, Bernie Sanders' whole campaign was an expression of the populist left. Now, what's odd in Canada is Canada's middle class has been gutted every bit as much as Britain's, as France's, as the United States. Right. Yet there really has been no populist expression on either the left or the right, okay? Maybe the conservatives will now move towards that. They certainly weren't in the past. The NDP had traditionally been the party of organized labor, but hasn't been that for decades. So everybody's sort of in this homogenous, buying into the status quo, and we haven't seen the rise of populism in Canada, even though Canada shares the same economic conditions, particularly the immiseration of its middle class, that other countries have that have seen the rise of populism, be it either on the right or the left.
Okay, so let's just step back again, because there's some things here that we've been talking about that I just want to break down a little more. We're talking about GDP, and you make the point in the book that GDP is a measure of growth, and it's often taken as a proxy for how well people are doing, but that in fact, that's not the case in the past 20 or 30 or 40 years. And the argument is usually made by the current finance minister and others in Canada and elsewhere that when you increase trade, more trade is better, and a high tide lifts all boats. And so why would that not be the case from your point of view?
It has not been the case because the relationship between GDP or GDP per capita and wages or incomes has totally broken down. There has been strong economic growth, and strong GDP growth translates on the income side of the national accounts into somebody's income has risen quite sharply. But guess what? It ain't yours, and it ain't mine, and it ain't most of the people who are watching this.
Is this what
it's in the 1 to 5%, and that's not an accident. Okay, that's a deliberate result of the kind of policies, not just that Canada has put in place, but that OECD governments have started put it in place since the Thatcher Reagan years, which was really the historical turning point in the mid 1970s. So that what we find is that the vast majority of Canadian households have seen little or no gains in real household income for the last 20, 30 years, even though GDP growth would suggest on the face of it that they should be doing just fine. But the top 5% have never had it so good. Yeah. And those are the very people who are telling you how good you have it.
Yeah. Well, I can't complain, but I have had this discussion ongoing for the last 20 years with people. And I always think about growing up in middle-class Scarborough in a suburb.
Okay, that's a middle-class place.
Right. My mom worked, but on my street, that was unusual, having a two-parent working household. Most other households only had one family paying the mortgage and paying all the bills. And by the time my wife and I started trying to buy a house and do those things, there's no possible way we could have done even close to that without two of us working. And now, you know, the younger people that I work with when I teach, they talk about 2, 3, 4 jobs in some cases. And so that, I think that's an example, a very practical example of what you're talking about. No real income growth, right?
That's right. And if you look generationally, every generation in the post-war period could look forward to a standard of living better than their parents. I mean, that's not a Canadian, that's a North American thing, not this generation. Not, you know, the millennials, Generation X, Generation Z. It's instead of going higher and higher and higher, you're going lower and lower and lower. And that has to do with what kind of jobs are being created and what kind of jobs are not being created. What are not being created are manufacturing jobs. What are being created is a lot of jobs in the so-called gig economy. Right. But you're not even considered a worker in that economy. You're an independent contractor, like for Uber or Lyft. And hence, minimum wage laws don't apply to you. Great if you're a shareholder in those companies. Not so great if you're dependent on living on the wage they pay. So I know it's all tied to, it's not an accident that things have evolved this way. It's just not some random chaos theory. There's a reason. Policies have benefited certain people at the expense of other people. Those who have paid the most is what we used to call the middle class.
So I have a question from an audience member who's talking about different kinds of policies, and they're interested in this idea of a guaranteed annual income and how that might relate to your argument about globalization and whether or not it supports global, or how does it, you know, how does it factor in? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy because with the kind of deficit that we have strapped on, it's not even clear that our current social programs are going to be sustainable, fiscally sustainable. Right. You know, I don't know if viewers follow the fiscal minutia coming out of Ottawa, but I think everybody realizes that we're strapping on deficits, the likes of which we have not seen as proportionate to the economy since World War II. I mean, this dwarfs anything that Paul Martin and John Chrétien had to address in the 1990s, okay? This will not end well, okay? Like Chrystia Freeland can get up there and pretend to Canadians that we're going to grow our way out of this deficit. That is total and utter nonsense. We are almost totally recovered from the decline in GDP that we suffered from the pandemic. We're about like 3% below the pandemic peak. We're going to regain that in the next quarter. We're still going to have a $350 billion deficit. There is going to be budgets of fiscal pain, no matter who's in Ottawa, that will involve not just spending cuts, but major tax increases, the only question is on whose shoulders that additional tax burden will be placed. And if I had to bet, it'll be placed on the middle class.
Right.
Because when it comes to trade policies, they're expendable. But
Right.
when it comes to raising tax revenue, they're indispensable.
So we just heard the spectacle of the Premier of the province of Ontario promising sick day credits as pandemic relief that wouldn't be paid for by businesses, but that would be paid for by the taxpayers.
Well,
and I thought of you.
And you know, I mean, in that particular case, you know, the route to stimulating the economy is not $100 billion stimulus. The route to stimulating the economy is to vaccinate shoppers. Okay. Right. The savings rate is 4 times higher at 12.7% than it was before COVID. It's not that Canadians don't want to spend. Right. It's that Canadians don't have the opportunity to spend. If you can vaccinate shoppers, we will see a surge in consumer spending, the likes of which we have not seen for decades, because there is an incredible amount of pent-up demand. And if you doubt that, just look at countries like the UK or the US that have had much more successful vaccination programs, and hence they're opening up retail. Retail numbers are going through the roof, and they will here too if we can vaccinate enough shoppers so that they can go into a store and shop. And Chrystia Freeland doesn't need to frivolously waste another $101 billion in stimulus spending that won't be needed. What the government needs to do is vaccinate people.
So, I mean, one of the solutions you've said is that it's going to fall on the shoulders. Well, you think it's going to fall on the shoulders of taxpayers, or of the middle class taxpayers anyway.
Well, I'll tell you whose shoulders they're not going to fall on, and I have absolute confidence in this. On the very plutocrats that Chrystia Freeland once wrote about before she was finance minister. Right. Because plutocrats, the 1%, they're not the 1% because of their paycheck. They're the 1% because they inherit dynastic wealth, or they make their money through huge capital gains increases, like the owner of Shopify, for example. They are treated very well by the tax system. Canada's the only G7 country that doesn't have an inheritance tax. Right. And while 100% of wage income is taxed, even by that someone making minimum wage, only 50% of capital gains is taxable. I have total 100% confidence that Chrystia Freeland will not move on either front, and that plutocrats will go unscathed, just as the Westons and other billionaires have profited from the pandemic because sales at places like pharmacies and grocery stores have soared. So where does that leave us, Thomas?
Where does that leave us? So, but I mean, one of the things you're suggesting is that because of the global pandemic and the challenges we're facing, quite aside from the fiscal questions that we're raising here, that there may be some changes that might lead to a silver lining for middle class taxpayers and others. I wonder if you could just describe why that might be so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's already happening. I mean, I think that we've all realized the fragility and vulnerability of global supply chains, and that it's going to have a demonstration effect much more than just vaccines and respirators. I think production is coming home, and that's a good news story for Canadian workers and for American workers. Now, you know, there's also been, you know, the goalposts have changed. I mean, Donald Trump hasn't been in the White House for months now. Have you noticed President Biden reducing any of the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on China? Because I haven't.
No.
Okay. Because the goalposts have moved. It's not just Donald Trump who thinks that the WTO was screwing American workers. Right. Now that has been generally recognized across the political spectrum. It hasn't here in Canada, but as I say, you know, Biden has kept all of Trump's trade restrictions in place, and these were the same restrictions that a President Sanders would have imposed had he been successful in capturing the Democratic nomination and winning the White House.
So, but Jeff, I mean, to talk about Trump again, everybody told us tariffs were bad. Aren't
Yeah,
tariffs bad?
sure. I mean, tariffs are bad if you're a shareholder. Damn right, tariffs are bad if you're a shareholder. But if you're a worker, maybe tariffs aren't so bad. You know, maybe it's better to have a smaller pie and a bigger slice. Okay. Because free trade has certainly increased the size of the pie, but the sliver being carved off for the middle class is so minuscule that they're worse off with the bigger pie.
Right. So, I mean, I think that you're envisioning or painting a picture of a situation where we maybe moving away from a less globalized world, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
with people too. I mean, not just the movement of goods. I mean, the other big facet of globalization, and this was particularly true in the first wave of globalization, which is often called the age of great migration. 50 million Europeans migrated to the United States between
Right.
1850, has been the mass movement of people. And that certainly has hit a brick wall.
Right.
And, you could say, well, Jeff, the pandemic, this is a temporary thing. I'm not sure this is that temporary, because I think what we're seeing, I mean, already there's, a border restriction on people coming from India and Pakistan because of what's happening with the variant.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, that could be around for a long, long time. And I think what we're going to see is international population mobility is going into reverse. Okay.
Right.
And that's something else that we can definitely attribute to the pandemic and its implications.
One of our viewers, Elizabeth Etu, asked, what can Canadian citizens do to exert influence on the government to improve wages for Canadians? So is there something people can do?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what they shouldn't have done. They shouldn't have approved this US, Mexico, Canada trade deal, because that allows Magna and Linamar and all the Canadian auto plant parts who haven't hired a Canadian worker in years to continue to shift plants down to Mexico and then export the goods duty free back into the United States or Canada. That's something that doesn't help the middle class. I think you could argue, well, that's nice, Jeff, but the trade agreement's already been negotiated. Okay. But what about fiscal policy? Who's going to pay for this deficit? Okay. Like, let's distribute the tax burden a little bit more evenly. Let's move in areas where the Liberal government fears, not to tread. Let's have a debate about raising the inclusion rate on capital gains. Let's have, not ordinary Canadian inheritance. I think the US is $5 million, but let's have an inheritance tax that taxes dynastic wealth, not middle class families leaving their house to their kids, but dynastic wealth, the Westons, the Irvings, okay? So they shouldn't go untaxed.
Above $5 million. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Let's start including them in the deficit reduction process, since they, more than any other segment of the population, have benefited financially the most from the pandemic.
But isn't the problem with that you have to wait for people to die before you can collect the tax?
Well, you're true. And Elizabeth Warren had a solution to that. Okay. She said, you're right. Bernie Sanders, of course, was proposing an inheritance tax. And she says, why wait for them to die? Why don't you just tax wealth? And that's something that we've never taxed. We tax income, but not wealth. Not all income. We don't tax 50% of capital gains. It's coming. Okay. It's coming. I mean, the goalposts are changing, and this isn't just something in Canada. Okay, like in the US, we're talking about a big increase in a corporate tax rate, which incidentally, Canada's is much lower than. That's right. Canada's taxes corporations a lot lower than even the Donald Trump 21%, let alone the 28% that Biden wants to take. So I think, okay, maybe the trade deal's done, but fiscal policy is going to be the issue for the next couple of years. Let's make sure the 1% don't go unscathed, Chrystia Freeland.
Well, so let's just say for a minute, I totally agree with everything you said.
Okay.
Do we not?
Are you just being nice, or do you really believe that?
I find a lot of it very persuasive. I wouldn't say when I first started I was inclined towards some of these ideas, but I'm now like, I'm starting to think, okay, one of the questions I would have as a policy person, I'm a policy lawyer,
Okay.
is okay, so I agree with you, Mr. Economist. Everything you say is a great idea. We need to do something, but so we here in Canada are 38 million people are going to do it. And then everybody's just going to leave and go to Japan or Malaysia or.
Oh, you mean that if we tax the rich, they'll take their money to Panama. Guess what?
Right.
They already have. It's not middle class Canadians who have bank accounts in Bermuda
Right.
and Panama and the Turks and Caicos. They've already gone there. But I will point out, Thomas, that these feelings that I'm expressing, they're being felt in a lot of places. Okay, the goalposts are moving. You're right in saying, how can Canada move unilaterally if it's out of sync with policies in the rest of the world? Won't that just encourage capital flight, right?
Exactly.
And then we won't have this capital invest in jobs and blah blah blah. Well, okay, but I'm just saying, this is not uniquely a Canadian problem. Policies are shifting, okay? And that I think that what we would find is that we would be, if we're going to raise corporate taxes, if we're going to impose a wealth tax, have an inheritance tax, fuller inclusion of capital gains in taxation, these are moves that we're going to see happening among our trading partners and among our most important trading partner, the United States.
So you mentioned the earlier time period a little earlier, and you talked a little bit about the wave of migration, the age of migration. We have an Andrew Carnegie Library here in Picton,
right?
Who was funded
part
600, and he famously said that immigrants were the stream of gold, right?
And when he's saying they're the stream of gold, they're the stream of something else to other people. Now, most of the people at that time in the age of migration were coming from Northern Europe and particularly Ireland. And you may remember the Martin Scorsese movie Gangs of New York, which captured, was Bill the Butcher really that bad? Or did Bill the Butcher have reason to hate the Irish immigrants who were coming off the boat? He did, because here's what happened. Wages started to go down because the Irish immigrants, particularly in the coastal areas where they settled, would work for a lot lower because compared to where they were coming from, which incidentally had a potato famine at the time. Okay, so that's not just a racial thing. These were white people, Christian, they were Catholic versus Protestant, but still the racial divide was not like as glaring as it has been with later waves of immigration, but they incurred the same kind of hostility, okay? Was that racism? Well, yes, it was, but it was a racism that was founded in economic reality, that the hordes, millions of Irish immigrants were depressing the wages of Native Americans and hence gave rise to Bill the Butcher.
Right. So, I think that raises a question about the present day, where we see a lot of these questions about race and immigration being thrown into a mix around sort of cultural issues, and people are talking about culture war. And
that's right.
Is it about a culture or is it about an underlying economic issue?
See, I think it's a class. Okay, I think deep down inside, this is a class war, and that the reason it's portrayed as something else is it serves the interests of those who benefit the most to have it portrayed as something else. So we'll have some token gender appointments on board of directors or some visible minorities on board of directors to address this racial divide. What we won't have is full inclusion of capital gains on taxation or an inheritance tax or tariffs that prevent you from just moving your factory to some sweatshop across the sea. Okay, so I think that the root cause is a class war. And, even in American politics, one of the startling things was how many Americans of Mexican descent in Texas supported tighter immigration laws.
Right.
And they had, there's an economic rationale for that. It's just not
Sure.
there. Okay. Now, the reason that Andrew Carnegie thought they were a fountain of gold is the same reason that, Canadian business groups are arguing to to raise dramatically our immigration. It's a source of cheap, available labor supply.
Right.
If I'm a shareholder, bring it on.
Right.
But if I'm, a meat packing worker, maybe, my wages are going to be going down if there's a whole bunch of migrants who are willing to take my job. So it depends on which side of the class divide, how you view this image. But so often, it's always considered xenophobic or racist. And I'm not saying that it isn't, that isn't part of the phenomena. I'm just pointing out there's an economic rationale, and there always has been.
Right. It's an interesting argument. Now, I wanted to ask you about why it is that China, why the WTO treats China the way it does right now. I wonder if you could just describe how that is and why it works that way.
Okay, because China, the same China that's expected to have a GDP greater than the United States in the next 15 years, is considered in the eyes of the WTO as a developing nation. And as a developing nation is entitled to have tariffs that are a multiple of developed nations. Okay.
Right.
So that's why if GM wants to, ship a car to China from its plant in Detroit, it's going to face something like a 25 to 30% tariff. But if it's going to ship a plant from a factory in China to a car dealership in the US, it pays a 5% tariff. And that's why I think that Donald Trump, I know that he's not popular up here, was 100% right on his criticism of the WTO, which incidentally was shared by Bernie Sanders. Again, neither of them would probably want to acknowledge that they were talking from the same page, but the fact of the matter is on trade policy, they were. In fact, his whole campaign against Hillary Clinton was he was attacking her on specifically this issue, her support for globalization, which indeed started with her husband. Bill Clinton was the one who advocated for China's inclusion into the WTO, which happened a year after that incident in Seattle. And I just pointed out in the book that, who would have thought among all the demonstrators in Seattle who would champion their cause 20 years later? Because I doubt one person would have said Donald Trump.
Right. Or you, maybe.
or me, for that matter. Okay, well, first of all, I haven't been the chief economist of an investment bank for 10 years. Okay. Right. I was for 20 years. It's not an ideal platform for the kind of stuff I have to say. I'm sure that's already appreciated, but I'm just saying the goalposts have changed. Okay, that now I think people have had a new look at what global supply chains really look like, and I think we're not talking lawn furniture here. Okay, we're talking your vaccine or your respirator, and that's I think caught people's attention.
High school friend of mine from Texas says, not a fan of university friend from Texas, not a fan of Trump or Saunders for different reasons, but even stock clocks are right twice a day.
Okay, well, look, first of all, Trump and Sanders were very different on a whole range of issues, tax policy being one and the culture wars being another. But something that doesn't get emphasized enough in the mainstream media, and I think for good reason, is how similar their policies were on trade, policies that, basically the mainstream media finds very objectionable, or has until this time anyway.
I got a question from somebody who's asked me to ask their question, and I'm going to say, Lynn, I can't see your question in the text box, so if you could retype it, I'll ask it. Then I'll take the opportunity now to say we're kind of getting towards the end here. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like me to pose to Jeff, I'd be happy to do so. One of the things, while maybe Lynn is retyping that question, I'll ask you is, let's just say that the things start to change. There is that middle silver lining for the middle class, and we start to move towards a less globalized, a managed trade system is what I think what you call.
Okay.
What is it? How is that going to change the world sort of in the next 10 years? What would next 10 years look like? What would the book you would write look like in 10
Okay,
years?
here's the trade-off that we're going to make. We're going to pay more for everything that we produce in Canada than what we can import from some sweatshop on the other side of the world. So we're going to trade off a better distribution of income, a increase in the welfare of the middle class for higher inflation. Okay. And that's going to have some interesting implications, as will a $350 billion deficit on what your mortgage rate will be. But maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Okay. So I have the question Lynn had was, and I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but maybe you do. I'm not an economist, so I don't know. What do you think of donut economics thinking with Kate Rayworth and Stephanie Kelton? Do you know what that means?
You got me.
Okay, sorry. And another question is, what links can you make between raising oil prices and diminishing prosperity?
Well, it depends whose prosperity. I mean, if you're talking about Alberta right now, they'd love to see higher oil prices because it certainly would increase the prosperity of Albertans. If you're talking about the whole world economy, I mean, high oil prices, everything else being equal, is a brake on growth. World oil consumption declined by almost 10 million barrels a day because of the pandemic, its impact on air travel, on motor travel. That's unprecedented, even compared to past recessions. Some people point to, oh, this is the sign of the greening of the economy. I would short that trade. I think that oil consumption and hence oil prices will come back when we reopen the economy. And for the people of Alberta, it couldn't happen sooner.
And so this is another follow-up question from a point we talked about earlier in terms of changing the relationship with China and maybe repatriating some of the manufacturing jobs back to North America, getting those good middle-class jobs back here. What if you were China? They're not going to just sit by and necessarily do nothing as that happens. So what steps might they take in retaliation or to counter an effort to do that?
Well, they'll probably continue with their Belt and Road policy, which is to build infrastructure all around the world, particularly in developing countries, but at the same time gaining effective control over key parts of those economies. That infrastructure will be critical in developing their global supply chains. I think where China's going to feel the greatest impact is in trade with countries like Canada, the United States, the OECD.
Right.
And if I'm China, I'm going to have to try to offset that with growing my trade with other countries, emerging countries. And I'm going to use my Belt and Road initiatives to tie their economies from an infrastructure supply standpoint to factories in China, which is, I think, what they're doing right now.
Of course, it's a big changing world out there. And we talked about capital flight and whatnot. Is that being, is there a role, or what role would, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and other kinds of things play in all of this? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would make it all the more difficult to be able to manage international capital flows. And indeed, that's one of the concerns, not just tax evasion, but money laundering. Certainly would complicate that process. But the vast majority of wealth held in the economy right now is in actual currency, not in digital currency. That may change over time, but I think the questioner is right in suggesting this over time will become more problematic.
Okay. Another question from our audience member here. I'm not sure I totally understand the context, but again, you may know this better than I do. What comments might you have on the fairly recent sale of Canadian Pharmacy Development and Trudeau's recent buyback of a minority share in the same business? I don't know if you know what that means.
In which company?
The pharmacy.
Oh, I don't know, but I do have some comments to make about pharmacies.
Okay, good.
Canada has the 11th largest pharmaceutical industry in the world. Why are we dependent on importing vaccines from India? would be a question that I think most Canadians would want to ask. Why is a country where the Conant laboratories developed insulin unable to produce a COVID-19 vaccine where Australia is producing under license? Okay. And the answer is because we have leaders that have unswerving faith in global supply chains. Maybe it's time for different leaders.
So what's like, what does that look like? If you say, well, we're going to break down the global supply chain, are we going to go back to the way it was in the 1920s? I don't know when the last time this was.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think the world really started to change around the mid 1970s.
Yeah.
And as I say, what was different then? The car you drove, the toaster you used, the drugs you took, were all made here or in the United States. And that all changed over, it took 30, 40 years. I think that's reversing. Do we go all the way back to 1973? I don't know. But there's a term in finance called mean reversion. In other words, when you go so far in one direction off the average, the following period, you go the other way. I think as far as globalization and trade policy, we are in a period of global mean reversion.
Right. Well, that's maybe a good point to end, but I don't know if you have any last comments to kind of wrap it up.
No, I think we've covered the bases. I want to thank the Prince Edward Library for hosting me on this. It's a beautiful part of the country. I was just biking there last fall and, hope to get out in the summer again. But again, once again, thank you for providing me this opportunity to talk to your viewers.
Well, thanks to Jeff Rubin for his support of County Reads. It's been a great chance to have the talk with you here today, Jeff. And you got some really interesting thoughts. And as I say, I'm a cautious convert to many of the views that are in the book, and I probably need to think about it a little more. But I look forward to reading everything else that you're going to be writing in the near future with respect to these issues.
Well, thank you very much. And great interview, Tom. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.